Good morning, Year 5, and happy Thursday. So, we're going to read chapter 14, On the River. It was almost completely dark when they found somewhere to moor, a place where the bank didn't rise too steeply from the river and where the trees didn't look so much like an army ranged on the bank. Lila steered the raft towards the land, and Fred jumped ashore. "I'll check there aren't any cayman marks," he said. "I'll come too," said Con. "No," said Max. He gripped her ankle. "Stay with me." Con flushed and swallowed a smile. She stayed. Fred walked through patches of trees, his heart beating in his ears, swinging a stick ahead of him through ferns, sniffing for the smell of anything recently killed. But it smelled only of growing things and of resin and birds. "It's fine," he called. "It's safe." His voice twisted, echoing through the trees to reach the others, and they shouted instructions back to him and to each other and pushed the raft ashore. It didn't occur to anybody not to trust one another now, he thought. They had become a pact, or an expedition, he corrected himself. That was what you called a group of explorers. They slept there that night on the forest floor, their backs touching. Though the day had been heavy with sun, the night was cloudless and cold, and Fred slept with his knees tucked up in his shirt. He found it was unexpectedly reassuring now to feel Max's foot near his nose when he turned into the night. When the nightmares came, it was good to be able to hear the others breathing. They travelled on for another day and another night, the river carrying them at its own pace of its silver back. None of them spoke much. They watched the sides of the bank, waiting, alert, tense. On the morning of the third day, they had barely cast off when it started to rain. Max was sitting staring out of the splashes rebounding on the river when he let out a scream. "Sharks! Lila, sharks!" "Where?" Lila grabbed Max's wrist. "Hold on to me," she said. "Don't move." Fred looked around. There was only the expanse of the water and the thrum of falling rain. "There are no sharks in the Amazon, Max," he said. "You don't have to worry." But even as those words were leaving his mouth, he saw what Max had seen, a fin, rising up out of the water. Con screamed. Lila let out a hiss. Fred froze. He said, speaking through rigid jaws, "Max, come away from the side of the raft." Then the fin dipped, disappeared, and out of the water leapt an air of pinkish grey body, curving against the rain and the thunder-coloured sun. "A dolphin," said Lila. Her whole face was transformed. Fred rubbed his eyes and looked again, but he hadn't imagined it. The dolphin was pink. The arc of pink was followed by another, dipping so that the half curve of its back rose out of the water, and another, and then a puff of water from a dolphin's blowhole. They were coming closer. "Shall we jump in?" asked Fred. "Would they let us swim with them?" "Don't," said Con. "There might be piranha." The pod of dolphins circled the raft at a distance. There was 5 of them, Fred thought, or possibly 6. One let tucked clean out of the water, only 6 feet away. Max clapped and squealed. "Shh," said Lila. "We have to be quiet, Maxie. They're deciding if they trust us." It did seem that was what the dolphins were doing. There was something spectacular in the way they swam closer, doubled back and away, and closer again. Then, without warning, the pod turned and began to swim away. The rain grew thicker. Fred's heart lurched. He couldn't bear to see them go. He pulled off his shoes, stood up and dived in, striking hard for the disappearing dolphins. As he neared them, 4 of the dolphins sped up and ducked deeper into the water, but one turned. Fred trod water. He held out his hand. He tried to stay as still as he could. The dolphin swam up to him, a shape of approaching under the surface. He gasped and spat out water. It rose grey and covered in deep scars along its back. Its snout was lined with fierce-looking teeth, but its eyes were steady and soft. Fred tried to steady his breathing. It was the most astonishing thing he'd ever seen. It was like a battered river god. He held out his hand again. "Hello," he whispered. "I'm Fred." The dolphin dipped its nose to Fred's hand. He gasped at the surprising roughness of its skin. It butted his hand, then huffed at it as if disappointed, and ducked down deep under the surface. Fred watched, expecting its shadow to disappear, but as he turned back to the raft, the dolphin erupted from the water in front of him. It leaped clean over his head, showering him with spray, dipped down again and disappeared. The others were shouting and beckoning from the raft. They hauled him up, all 3 trying to grab him at once. Fred couldn't speak, or he didn't want to. He wanted the memory to be sharp, carbon copied onto his heart. He imagined his father's face when he told him. His heart sang and thrummed in his chest, but the others were boiling over with questions and ideas. It was like they trusted you, said Con. Or maybe it thought you were going to feed it, said Lila. Maybe someone was feeding them those sardines, said Fred. Later that day, just as Fred's head was beginning to swim with hunger, Lila spotted a fig tree on the shore. Fred climbed up and shook the fruit down onto the raft. They tied the sleeves and neck of its cricket jumper and made it into a sack. Max counted as he put them in. 112, he said, triumphant. Behind him, Lila mouthed, 53. I always hated figs at school, said Con. I thought they tasted like eating someone else's snot. But actually, they're the best thing in the world. Max fished a handful of figs out of the sack and pushed them into his pocket. These ones are mine. I don't like sharing, he said. Lila fed one of the figs to Backer, who ate it hungrily, and an hour later pooed lavishly over the lap. She laughed and watched her skirt at the edge of the raft. Sloths only go to the bathroom about once a week, she said, so at least it's done for a few days. Backer looked thin and even more wide-eyed than usual. They poo half their body weight each time, she said. That sounds stressful, said Con. The surface of the raft was constantly being washed with river water, so Lila draped the clean skirt over her shoulders to dry, travelling down the river like a floating scarecrow. Fred's shoes and shorts were sodden wet, but his shirt remained bone dry. The sun was hotter than the 2 days put together. Con's cheek and forehead grew a bright pink with sunburn. Lila made her a cold compress out of the weeds and plaited leaves, which leaked green water down over her eyebrows, but eased some of the burning. That night, as they lay on a bed of fallen leaves, Backer moved across Lila's shoulder, sniffed at her neck and climbed up Fred's calf. Sloths were nocturnal, and Backer seemed unusually sprightly by sloth standards. He fastened his arms and legs around Fred's knee and began to chew at his shorts. Fred lay still, trying not to move his leg as he looked up at the stars. They broke out in spirals and galloping animals and clustered like hordes of white butterflies ranging across the sky. Lila was watching too. "Fred," she whispered, "are you awake?" "Yes," he whispered back. "The moon's so close." She sounded half asleep. "You could wear it as a hat." Fred nodded in the darkness but didn't speak. "At home," she whispered, "you only ever get small squares of sky, however much you can fit between buildings and churches' spires." "Yes," whispered Fred, "I've never seen anything like this." Lila's voice grew even quieter. "Fred, are you going to be okay?" He kept staring up at the sky. "I don't know." Con stirred and turned to look at them. "Are you scared?" she whispered. "Yes," said Fred. He had never been so frightened in his life, but they were alive. He held that thought in his hand, tight against his skin. "Me too," Lila said. "Don't tell Max." "Me too," whispered Con. She gave a grunt of disgust. But that's obvious. I can't work out how to hide it like you do." They lay, breathing close to one another. "When this is over," said Lila, "let's all swear to meet somewhere." "Where?" asked Con. "Where's the most famous place to eat in London?" "The Ritz," said Fred. "Then we'll meet there," said Lila, "and we'll have won every single kind of cake, and this will be like a dream." "And hot chocolate," murmured Max. He sounded 3/4 asleep. "Max," said Lila, twisting to touch his forehead, "go back to sleep." Fred stole a look at the other three. Con had closed her eyes. Her brow was furrowed, but her lips had half a smile at the tips. On the 4th day the river began to change. The trees arched densely overhead and the water was choked with weeds. It no longer smelt fresh. Fish flitted through the reeds. "Are they piranhas?" said Con. "I mean, piranha." Lila peered down over the edge of the raft and nodded. Her jaw set. She stroked Backer, hanging round her neck, and buried her chin in his fur. Her breath, as she exhaled, was shaky. It was mid-morning, but it grew dark as the branches thickened above them. "Is it just me, or does the river feel suddenly less on our side?" asked Con. "No, not just you," said Fred shortly. His upper lip and forehead were dripping sweat. The sweat wasn't only from the work of poling, but he had Con's bark map in his pocket, and the thought of it warmed his chest, beating back against the cold doubt in his stomach. The current was in their favour, but travelling through the weeds with arm-aching, back-stretching, skin-shredding work. "Watch out!" called Lila. Fred flinched, looking around for something about to hit him in the face, then watched in silence as a snake slipped along a branch, spiralled up the trunk of a tree and disappeared into the green over their heads. Even Max didn't move. "Almost certainly not deadly," said Fred. He winced. He'd intended it to sound reassuring, but instead his voice landed somewhere between desperate lion and stern ant on a deathbed. He concentrated on doubling his speed until they were past the weeds, and they sped down the dark green passageway of overhanging trees. "We're close," said Fred. "On the map this river goes on until it meets a lake. I think it would be 3 or 4 hours, but it's hard to tell. And then there's a black, square, and then a short line. That might be a path or a river, but could just be a squiggle, and then the X. Con reached into the water for a flattish stick as it floated by, and began to paddle. The sooner we get there, the sooner we'll know the worst. The raft followed the river, Fred's pole splashing in his impatience to see... Sorry, that was my dog. The raft followed the river, Fred's pole splashing in his impatience to see what was around the next corner. He guided the raft around a floating fallen tree, traversed along 5 minutes of dark water, and found, without warning, that they had come to the mouth of a small lake. The lake was an exquisite blue shining under a cloudless sky, but Fred did not notice. They all four sat crouched on the raft, looking up, their jaws open and their eyes wide. There was a long silence. Then Lila spoke. "Did I ever mention I'm terrified of heights?" So, for today's activity, we are going to be writing our story. We're going to be thinking about, using our plans that we looked at yesterday. Please do not worry if these have not been completed. That's something that we can keep on going back to, because I know that was quite a long activity. For the first starter, what we're going to be doing is we're going to think of different front adverbials we can use. This is really important, and it is year 4 work, is this, to first of all make our story seem a lot more interesting, and changing it a little bit so we're not repetitive with all our sentences. Let's have a look at some of the examples I've used here. Are there any that you like? If there are, magpie them, put them in your notebook that you think, oh, I'll use that for when I'm writing my story. Is there any that you can use yourself? Anything that we can relate back to the story? Have a go and write some of them in your book. You can use different coloured pens to really make them highlight. In class, what they're doing is they're going to be writing on the sentence stacking paper and putting it on the working wall so that everyone can magpie them. So just like with any start of parts of our writing, we need to think about success criteria. So this is something that we think our story needs to include. So I've had a go myself here. I've said use capital letters for all the characters and places, use correct punctuation, use the fantastics to help create a clear image for the reader, use paragraphs for cohesion, use dialogue to create tension, use dialogue to help develop the characters, and use dialogue to help advance the action. Have a look at these. I would write these down so that when you are writing your story this week and next week, you'll be able to tick off when you know you've done them. Are there any more that you think we need to include? If there are, write them down and send me a little message. So this is where we are going to start our writing. I want you to think about, what is it we are starting our writing for? We are doing our plot point 1, so that's the opening, and it's the plane journey and the crash. Now, to help me with this, I had different word mats in front of me. I thought about the fantastics, and I also had the Explorer book in front of me. So those are all the things that you can use in front of you, just like you would in class, and you'd have the working wall to help you. So I thought about how will I start my opening? Well, I probably want to think about how I'm going to have a positive and then a negative description. The positive is because they're boarding the plane, they're excited, they're going to Maynooth. And then the second paragraph, is all about when the plane crashes. So I'm going to be thinking about what negative vocabulary will I use to reflect this. I wanted to use the first part was to describe what I could see. So I've said, wispy white clouds dotted the vivid blue sky. It was time for the lonesome children to bid their farewells and board the small grey plane. The laughter soon moved into a silence. It was time for the pilot to make his final checks. Like a crowd of vivid green umbrellas, the Amazon jungle never looked so beautiful. The plane soared high into the sky. All 4 children sat relaxed, deep into their chairs, whilst the plane followed the swerve of the Amazon River. The tranquil peace of the journey was soon interrupted by the roar of the engine. Fred glanced to the cockpit to see the pilot violently belching and jerking the joystick. Looking nervously behind him, Fred could see the brother and sister holding hands desperately whilst whispering. The girl, who was very sure of herself, had her eyes shut tight. As the plane lurched away from the river and down towards the ground, Fred knew he had to do something. It was too late. The roar ceased and the nose of the plane plummeted deep into the Amazon jungle. Just looking there, have a think about what I've used, okay? I've started sentences like a crowd of vivid green umbrellas. So I've started it with a simile. Think about how I've tried to use the fantastics to help me there, okay? I've thought about action, thought about the hearing words. And this is where all the work you've done from the past few weeks is really going to help you. So do flip back, okay, and have a look. See if you can have a go. See if you can write, okay? You're the starter of your story. Remember, we don't need a full story. We're not going to go ahead far too much because we need to take it time. I'd rather quality than quantity, okay? Tomorrow we'll be looking at plot point 2, so please just take your time for the plot point 1, okay? Have your plan out in front of you and see what you need. Notice though how I'm using Fred, okay? I'm not saying I'm using Fred's name, just like Catherine Rundle does in the story, okay? Good luck, take your time. If you need any help, please just write on Edmodo and I will be able to help you, okay?